The fluorescent lights in the probate courtroom buzzed with a frequency that made my jaw ache. I focused on that sound, anything to avoid looking at my father's performance. Dennis wiped away tears that didn't exist, his voice cracking at precisely rehearsed intervals as he told Judge Patterson about my deteriorating mental state. Behind him, the gallery was packed with relatives he'd personally called, each one invited to witness what he promised would be a difficult but necessary intervention. My Aunt Rebecca dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. My cousin Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. They'd all come expecting a tragedy, the pitiful collapse of Dennis's troubled daughter. I pressed my thumbnail into the pad of my index finger under the table, a grounding technique my actual therapist had taught me. The sharp pressure kept me present, kept me from floating away into the rage that wanted to consume me, because in exactly 4 minutes my father's entire world was going to detonate, and I needed to be completely calm when it happened. My name is Nina, I'm 34, and I used to be a forensic accountant. This is the story of how I turned my father's greed into his prison sentence. The thing about growing up with a narcissist is that you learn to read the room before you learn to read books. By age 7, I could predict my father's moods by the way he parked his car. Crooked meant someone had challenged him at work. Straight meant he'd won something. By 12, I understood that his praise wasn't love, it was investment. He only valued me when I made him look good. My grandmother understood this too. Before she died 3 years ago, she sat me down in her garden, the one place my father never visited because the pollen aggravated his allergies. She handed me a folder containing every financial document related to her estate. "Your father thinks I'm leaving everything to him," she said, her arthritic fingers squeezing mine. "But I'm leaving it to you, not because you're my favorite, but because you're the only one who won't spend it trying to impress people who don't matter." The trust was worth $5.2 million. She'd built it from nothing, investing carefully over 50 years. She made me promise 2 things: keep it away from Dennis and use it to build something real. I kept half of that promise. "Your Honor," Dennis said, his voice rising with manufactured desperation. "My daughter hasn't paid rent in 8 months. She's been evicted twice. She can't hold down a job. She wears the same 3 outfits in rotation. I've watched her spiral for years, and I've tried everything. Therapy, medication management, financial counseling. Nothing works. She needs help, and she needs someone who loves her to make the hard decisions." I watched him sell it. He was good. I'll give him that. The trembling hands, the pained expression, the way he looked at me with what someone who didn't know him might mistake for concern. To everyone in that courtroom, he looked like a devoted father at the end of his rope. But I knew what he really was: a man drowning in debt, staring at his last lifeline. 3 months after my grandmother's funeral, Dennis showed up at my studio apartment unannounced. I was eating cereal in my pajamas at 2 p.m. because I'd worked a night shift analyzing shell company formations for a law firm. He looked around my 400-square-foot space with barely concealed disgust. "Jesus, Nina, this is what you're doing with your inheritance?" He kicked a stack of financial journals I'd been reading. "Living like a college dropout while I'm trying to maintain the family reputation?" I didn't tell him that the college dropout apartment cost $600 a month, which meant I was saving $4,000 monthly compared to the high-rise he assumed I should rent. I didn't mention that every dollar I saved went into carefully researched investments that were currently returning 12% annually. I just apologized and promised to do better. Because that's what you do with predators. You make yourself look weak until you're ready to strike. He bought it. Over the next 18 months, he called me regularly to complain about his own problems. His investment firm was struggling. Clients were leaving. Overhead was killing him. His luxury car lease was crushing him financially. Then the calls started getting more specific. Had I thought about letting him help manage my trust? Professional management, family rates. He could turn my grandmother's modest nest egg into something really impressive. All I had to do was sign some paperwork. I told him I'd think about it. What I actually did was hire 3 different forensic specialists to audit every financial move Dennis had made in the last decade. What they found was breathtaking in its scope. He'd been running a sophisticated fraud scheme for years, taking client money, showing inflated returns on paper while actually investing in high-risk ventures, using new client deposits to pay out old clients, a classic Ponzi structure that was about to collapse. He needed fresh capital. He needed it desperately, and his mentally incompetent daughter had $5.2 million just sitting there. "Miss Nina," Judge Patterson said, adjusting her reading glasses, "your father has presented some serious concerns about your ability to manage your affairs. Would you like to respond to these allegations?" Dennis leaned forward in his chair. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. He expected me to get emotional, to cry, to defend myself in a way that would only prove his point. Strong emotion equals instability, equals incompetence, equals guardianship. I stood up slowly, smoothing down the blazer I'd bought specifically for this hearing. Not too expensive, not too cheap, perfectly calculated to look like someone barely holding it together. "I'm listening, Your Honor," I said, my voice flat and measured. "I'm just wondering when my father plans to mention the $750,000. The courtroom went silent. Dennis's confident smirk flickered. Just for a second, but I saw it. "What is she talking about?" Judge Patterson asked. I opened the folder in front of me, the only item I'd brought to the hearing. Over the past 2 years, $750,000 has been transferred out of my grandmother's trust account. My father is correct that I didn't report it to the police. He's correct that I didn't freeze the account. What he's not mentioning is why. Dennis recovered quickly. He always did. "This is exactly what I'm talking about, Your Honor. She's creating paranoid fantasies. Those transfers were authorized. She gave me power of attorney 3 years ago because she was too overwhelmed after her grandmother's death. She signed the documents herself." His lawyer, a nervous man named Stewart, who'd been sweating since the hearing started, jumped up and handed a notarized document to the bailiff. "This proves my client had full legal authority to manage that account. Any transfers were legitimate investment activities." I watched Judge Patterson examine the power of attorney document. My signature was right there, clear as day. I had signed it. Dennis slipped it into a stack of funeral paperwork when I was exhausted and grieving. One signature among 30, all of them supposedly routine estate documents. "The signature appears authentic," Judge Patterson said carefully. "It is authentic," I agreed. "I signed it 3 years ago without reading it carefully enough. That was a mistake that taught me to never skip the fine print again." Dennis relaxed slightly. He thought this admission proved his point. "But that document," I continued, "gives him authority over one specific trust account. It doesn't give him immunity from prosecution for wire fraud." I turned to face Dennis directly for the first time since the hearing started. "You know what's funny, Dad? You always told me I was too emotional to succeed in business. You said successful people make decisions with their heads, not their hearts. So when I discovered you were stealing from me, I tried to think like you would, strategically, patiently." About a year ago, I'd been reviewing my quarterly trust statements when I noticed transfers I hadn't authorized. Small at first, then increasingly bold. That's when I started documenting everything. I pulled out the first evidence packet. These are the IP logs for every transfer out of that trust account. Every single one originated from your home office computer, the same computer you used to access my account at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3:15 a.m. on a Friday, 1:33 a.m. on a Sunday. Interesting hours for legitimate investment activities. Stewart was on his feet. "Your Honor, these," I continued, placing down a second packet, "are the wire transfer confirmations. The money didn't go to legitimate investment firms. It went to something called Apex Consulting, a shell company registered in Nevis, a company you incorporated 3 years ago using your girlfriend's maiden name. I'm sorry. Should I say current girlfriend? I know there have been several." The gallery erupted. My aunt's tissue dropped from her hand. My cousin Marcus's mouth fell open. Dennis's face had gone from confident to pale to red in the span of 30 seconds. "She's making this up. She's sick. Can't you see? This is paranoid delusion." "Paranoid," I repeated. "That's the word you used when I was 16 and told Mom you were having an affair. You said I was paranoid, reading too much into innocent business dinners. Mom believed you. She always believed you." I placed a third document on the judge's bench. This is the private investigator's report from that time. Turns out I wasn't paranoid. I was just observant. Mom found this report after she filed for divorce. She never told you she hired someone. She just quietly gathered her evidence and left. I looked back at Dennis. I learned everything I know about patience from watching her. Judge Patterson held up her hand. Miss Nina, I need to understand something. If you knew about this theft, if you had this evidence, why didn't you report it immediately? Why allow it to continue? This was it, the question I'd been waiting for. Because of something my grandmother told me before she died, I said. She said, your father has been skating by on charm and intimidation his whole life. He's never faced real consequences because he's always kept his crimes just small enough to forgive. If you ever get the chance to stop him, don't wound him. End it completely. I turned back to Judge Patterson. If I'd stopped him at $50,000, it would have been a civil matter. Family dispute. He would have claimed misunderstanding, paid some restitution, maybe gotten probation, and in 5 years, he'd be right back here trying to access my accounts again, claiming I'd moved past it and forgiven him. I let that sink in for a moment. So I disabled the security alerts on my account. I documented every theft. I waited until he'd stolen enough to cross state lines multiple times with wire transfers exceeding $500,000 total. That creates a pattern of interstate wire fraud sufficient to trigger federal charges. I didn't lose $750,000, Your Honor. I spent it. That was the price of making sure my father never gets the chance to do this to anyone else. The courtroom was dead silent. Even the bailiff had stopped moving. Dennis lunged forward, his careful facade completely gone. You little... Stewart grabbed his arm, yanking him back down, but the damage was done. The mask had slipped. But that's not all, is it, Dad? I asked softly. You didn't just come here to take control of my trust. You came because you're desperate. Your Ponzi scheme is collapsing. You've got about 6 weeks before your clients realize their portfolio statements don't match reality. You need my money to plug the holes. I placed the final document on the bench. This is a forensic audit of Dennis's investment firm. It shows a classic Ponzi structure with approximately $4.3 million in fraudulent liabilities. Clients think they're earning 12% annually. They're actually losing everything. Stewart was frantically whispering to Dennis, but Dennis wasn't listening. He was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. How? He whispered. How did I figure it out? I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I'm a forensic accountant, Dad. It's literally what I do. You taught me to read people. My actual education taught me to read financial statements. Turns out I'm better at both than you ever were. Judge Patterson set down her pen. Her expression had shifted from judicial neutrality to something harder. Mr. Dennis, I'm denying your petition for conservatorship. Furthermore, I'm ordering these documents to be immediately forwarded to the U.S. Attorney's Office for review. Dennis's face crumbled, not with shame. He was incapable of that, with rage and disbelief that his incompetent daughter had outmaneuvered him. But wait, Stewart said desperately. The power of attorney is valid. Those transfers were authorized for account management, I interrupted, not for personal enrichment, not for funneling money into shell companies, not for propping up a fraudulent investment scheme. The power of attorney doesn't give him the right to commit federal crimes with my money. I turned to Dennis one last time. You called me incompetent, mentally unfit, a danger to myself. You dragged our entire family here to watch you take control of my life. But here's what you never understood, Dad. I learned from the best. You taught me that family is just another word for leverage. You taught me that trust is a weapon if you know how to use it. You taught me to always have a backup plan. I gathered my documents and slid them back into my folder. The difference between us is that my plans actually work. The bailiff was already moving toward Dennis as Judge Patterson made a phone call. I could hear her saying something about immediate notification to federal authorities. As I walked toward the courtroom exit, I passed my Aunt Rebecca. She reached out as if to touch my arm, maybe to apologize, maybe to ask if I was okay. I kept walking. She'd sat there silently while Dennis tried to have me declared incompetent. She'd believed him without question because it was easier than challenging him. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun felt different, cleaner somehow. I stood on the steps for a moment, breathing in air that didn't taste like recycled courtroom atmosphere and my father's desperation. My phone buzzed, a text from my actual therapist. "How did it go?" I typed back. "I'm free." 3 weeks later, federal marshals arrested Dennis at his office. The charges included wire fraud, investment fraud, and perjury related to his courtroom testimony. His face was on the local news that night, doing the perp walk in handcuffs. The confident swagger was gone. He looked small and old and scared. His girlfriend, the one whose maiden name he'd used for the shell company, had apparently known nothing about it. She cooperated with investigators and left him before the arrest was even made public. I didn't watch the footage. I didn't need to. I was busy closing the sale on his downtown office building, the one I'd quietly purchased 8 months earlier through my own shell company. Shortly after, I'd confirmed the extent of his fraud. He'd been so focused on accessing my trust that he never noticed I'd become his landlord. The eviction notice was delivered the same day as his arrest. 30 days to vacate. Professional, legal, and absolutely final. My aunt called that night. "Nina, I'm so sorry. We had no idea. If we'd known what he was really doing—" "You did know," I said calmly. "You knew he was a liar. You knew he was manipulative. You've known for 30 years. You just didn't care because it wasn't your problem. Now it's not my problem either." I hung up before she could respond. Here's what I learned from all of this. Sometimes the strongest revenge isn't dramatic confrontation. It's not screaming or fighting or trying to make them understand what they did wrong. Sometimes the strongest revenge is simply becoming someone they can never touch again. My father thought he could control me because I was quiet. He mistook careful observation for weakness. He confused patience with passivity. And by the time he realized his mistake, he was already standing in the trap he'd built for himself. I didn't destroy my father's life. I just held up a mirror and forced him to face what he'd been doing in the shadows. The destruction was all his own work. I just made sure he couldn't walk away from it this time. Dennis ultimately took a plea deal to avoid a lengthy trial. He pled guilty to wire fraud and investment fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence of 8 years in federal prison. He'll be eligible for parole in 5 years if he demonstrates good behavior, which seems unlikely given that he's spent the first 6 months filing frivolous appeals and claiming he's the victim of a conspiracy. 2 years later, my life looks completely different. I live in a real apartment now, not because I needed my father's approval, but because I don't need to prove anything anymore. I still take the bus sometimes, not because I can't afford a car, but because I like the quiet time to read. I still shop at discount stores occasionally, not because I'm broke, but because my grandmother taught me that real wealth isn't about impressing strangers. I think about her often, especially when I'm managing the foundation I created with what was left of the trust. She wanted me to build something real. So I did. We fund financial literacy programs for young people, especially those from families where money is used as a weapon. We teach them to read contracts, to understand compound interest, to recognize the warning signs of financial abuse. We teach them to trust themselves more than they trust people who claim to know better. My mother reached out after she saw the news about Dennis's arrest. She lives upstate now, remarried to a kind man who treats her well. She told me she was proud of me for standing up to him, something she'd wished she'd done more forcefully years ago. We meet for coffee once a month, slowly rebuilding a relationship that Dennis had worked hard to poison. Some people never learn. Some people are so committed to being the hero of their own story that they'll rewrite reality rather than face the truth. I hope Dennis has a lot of time to think in prison. I hope he eventually understands that I didn't do this because I hated him. I did it because I finally loved myself more than I feared him. If you're reading this and you recognize yourself in my story, if you've got a parent or a relative who's trying to convince everyone you're incompetent, who's trying to take control because they're drowning in their own failures, I want you to know something. You're not crazy, you're not incompetent, and you're not alone. The people who call you paranoid are often the ones with something to hide. The ones who say you're too emotional are usually the ones manipulating your emotions. The family members who accuse you of tearing the family apart are typically the ones who've been quietly breaking it for years. Trust your instincts. Document everything. And remember that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to stop trying to save someone who's determined to drown. Before you go, here's a quick bonus for sticking around. If you love learning and growing like I do, you need to try audiobooks. I've got an exclusive deal with Audible. Your first month is completely free. That's access to over 500,000 titles, zero cost to you. All the details are waiting in the description. Don't miss this one.